Bonnie, you wrote quite a nice piece, and I don't have it with me, I'm sorry, about where you come from. Because one of the first questions I like to ask is more or less how one comes to be a professional artist, how one makes the jump into that arena. And everyone has a different story, of course. But I really enjoyed your story about where you grew up and where you came from, the background that you have, and that, in some respects, is an opening to the real question, which is how you came to be a professional artist.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to tell that story?
I'd love that.
My people come from the Canadian Shield, north shore of Lake Huron, in central Ontario, and my grandparents were trappers and lived what would now be termed a traditional life. And I feel very privileged that I witnessed that, and also privileged to have witnessed the transformation from that into what is now my life here as a professional artist in Toronto. So there is a trajectory in my life that I can trace to a cultural history, if that's not too grandiose a claim, because for sure, in essentially one generation, we have moved from living very traditionally on the land, completely self-sufficient, completely sovereign lives, to what we have now, which is struggling to understand ourselves as contemporary artists within a contemporary academic situation, with all of the European overlay that implies. I don't know if I've skirted that issue or not.
I know that you studied art, of course. I know you studied OCAD. But in your studies, were they? What brought you to those studies?
I knew from very early on that I had a story to tell. I saw a transformation occurring in my homeland and in the lives of my parents and my grandparents that no one had language for. When I would ask, what is that over there? Because industrialization was beginning to happen in our part of the world. They discovered uranium when I was very, very small, 30 kilometers north of us, and the mining efforts around the discovery of uranium is actually what transformed our community from a small, self-sufficient trapping community into the site of incredible devastation as a result of the mining. And so I was witness to that as a young child, and my parents and grandparents, probably out of a sense of protection for me, wouldn't really talk about what was happening. And so I grew up with a central mystery in my life. And I think it was the resolve to somehow understand that mystery that made me want to be an artist, that gave me the, I think an art practice always is rooted in a question and a problem-solving kind of mode of thinking and acting in the world, and for sure that was where I learned that. Was this deep question about what is going on, that we had these big piles of yellow powder suddenly emerge in the middle of our community. And they were beautiful. They were abstract images. They were big triangles, big domes. They were this brilliant yellow. And the ground all around them was all black. It had been turned black by the action of the sulfuric acid. I find out later it was sulfuric acid. This was being used in the refining of the uranium. But they were leaving it raw on the road in the middle of our community. And no one could explain that to me. And I remember as a little girl lying in bed in my grandparents' house thinking to myself, I'm going to find out what those are. I'm going to find out and I'm going to tell people what that is. And that really was the turning point for me.
So if I could ask the question, most fundamentally, what is an artist? But more specifically, what does an artist do, or what can an artist do? What does an artist bring to a culture? Perhaps what you were just talking about is one clue, that is to say, to try to understand something and to reveal it as a story, as a true story, or as a metaphysical story. Do you think, is that how you understood what an artist could do?
I think my understanding of what an artist is and can do continues to evolve. So when I began to think about how to be in the world, it wasn't to say, well, I'm going to be an artist. It was to say, how can I find a job that will allow me to engage with this information, these phenomena, in a way that is active and satisfying to me. Yes, so when I was first beginning to think about art, or first beginning to think about my life as something that I could actually do something with, this took me a long time. I don't think that everybody regards themselves in that relationship with their life that artists do. I think that as an artist, one assumes that one will be able to respond. And in my family, that notion of responding to political realities or social realities or even the materiality of life was quite foreign. I came from a family that didn't have very much agency. And I think that it was difficult for me to really get a hold of the idea that I could respond in an individual, meaningful way. And the way that I found to do that was as an artist.
Is that something that you brought to your studies, or is that something that you took away from your studies?
That's interesting. I brought longing to my studies when I entered university to begin studying art making. I was starving and lusting for an opportunity to engage with my reality in a responsive way. And OCAD gave me the tools to be able to respond. So those things developed, and actually that's why I say that my view of what an artist is continues to evolve, because as I become ever more responsive, as I learn more techniques for perceiving and then replying, I discover more nuances of the artistic practice.
I want to turn to, I guess I'm fast forwarding a little bit,
Okay.
but not entirely. I want to turn to the question, which is something that you've already started to look at. I want to turn to the question of what coheres within this with respect to your own productions, Bonnie. I guess more broadly I could say, is there a coherent concept or a core strategy or idea that you want to understand through your work? And I'm going to actually ask you if you would be interested in talking about the Tecumseh Papers in that respect, but let's get back to the first part and how you see a coherence in the strategies that you've developed.
So a couple of things with respect to that particular body of work, which has to do with history. So history as it is written, history as it is received by those who read what is written, and then narrative as it is not written but experienced, and to go back to this notion of perceiving with a more subtle ear, that which has almost disappeared. So to develop a kind of antenna for the historical truth that lies within the words that have been written. So the thing that coheres, I think, throughout most of the work that I've been doing over the past 20 years is to trace out the between the lines story that is not written but is present. And this is what I came here to do. And I realized this as I was moving through my studies and began to be able to hear, almost as my instructors were speaking, hear another voice behind that wasn't necessarily contradicting, but was correcting with some assurance. And this voice of assurance, I mean, who knows where that came from? It certainly didn't come from my lived experience. I had never, well, I won't go there. What I'll say is that the fact that there was another story behind the written story was an insight that toppled everything that I had hung my life upon. And so I needed to build another structure. And I would say that the resulting work has been to develop a new structure that I can build my life on, that I can trust, and that I can move around. It has mobility. It's not fixed. And so this is freedom, and also truth in some way, a deeper kind of truth. And I would say that that's really what my practice is about, on a really personal level.
Would you care to talk about the Tecumseh Papers?
Yes, it was quite arbitrary. I was given the assignment by a curator, Srumoy Mitra, at the Art Gallery of Windsor. She said to me, would you be interested in coming and looking at these two busts that we had? They had two terracotta sculptures of General Brock and Tecumseh. And this was ahead of the anniversary of the War of 1812. And so this was a very celebrated Canadian iconic event, and they wanted me to do some work around these two figures. And so I went and I looked at them and I began to read the histories about General Brock. There was not a great deal about Tecumseh. He was not, although an iconic figure, he was not really chronicled or accounted for at the depth level that I was seeking. And I quickly, for that reason, was attracted to him because his absence was like a magnet for me. And Brock was so present, he was so illuminated that I lost interest in him, and I began to focus on Tecumseh. I began to look for Tecumseh. I ordered all the books I could, I searched for him, I went to Walpole Island and walked where I thought that he had walked. I went to the places where I thought he had been, and I went to Michigan, I went down to Ohio, I really looked for him. And I couldn't find him. And I was responsible to create this body of work about this figure, and I had nothing. And some friends gave me an opportunity to travel to Italy. They had a house in the northern hills in the Piedmont. And they invited me to go and spend a month there. And it was 4 months before the exhibition was to open. I had copious notes, I had notebooks, I had accumulated a lot of knowledge, but I really didn't have anything to show. And on this crazy whim, almost irresponsibly, I decided to go to Italy. And it was there that Tecumseh came to me, and I found him. And I think it had something to do with the isolation of the little house where I was staying, and the remove from North America, and all of the expectations that was building here for this celebration around 1812, 2012, the 200th anniversary of this great battle. He walked into the kitchen in the little house in Chesapeake. I had begun a practice of, I had a large biographical novel about Tecumseh, and I had been reading it and circling various words in the text. So every time it said war, I drew a circle around that. Every time it said gun, I drew a circle around that. Every time it said Indian, I drew a circle. So I had this 700-page book that every page had been written and covered in these arrows and circles. And one day, they just sort of fell away, and I saw the story behind. And I began to draw that story. And so, so for me, the notion of the history as it is received in Canadian consciousness, and the history of this lived Anishinaabe man who found himself at the very edge of this tremendous struggle for our homeland. It needed a kind of letting go for me to be able to receive that story. So I began to make those words. does that say? Should I say more?
You know.
I just ended up cutting up the book. I ended up pulling apart the history books and making work out of those books. So I made a cloak. I made images for the walls. I made plaques. I drew on top of those books because I felt that I wanted to challenge their story, but not only challenge it, but enrich it. Not to completely erase it or burn it or throw it away, but to say, look, there is this other part, and if you just look a little bit this way, maybe you can see it too, and how beautiful it is. So yes, Tecumseh for me still is a moment in my own life as a Anishinaabe woman where I actually touched against a spirit of something that is true.
Just as an aside, I was struck when one of my former students, Sona, from Iran, mentioned that in her Iranian culture, that one typically looks not to the line, but the words between the lines.
Aha. Yes. Yes. For sure. The negative space. And so, of course, as a sculptor, almost instinctively aware of the negative space, and this happens both in text, and it's very evident in text, and it happens in transcribing text into beadwork, where one literally pierces and unpierces this filament of paper, which contains this truth in Western thinking, but in my thinking needs to be pierced and pierced and pierced, because you need to look around and under it. And so to make those, I made 3 large treaty belts that are documents, Western English and United American documents, translated those into beaded belts for the same reason, to look at the way that the textual representation of a history is not sufficient.
There's a work in the studio right at the moment, which in fact is here, and it's almost impossible to ignore. And, but I'm curious about it, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that as well.
Well, this actually I made in 2007, so this is quite old. I was thinking about, this was at the very beginning of the awareness in Canadian consciousness of the difficulties in the very far north of Ontario. So there is a town called Kasheshawan, Kasheshawan First Nation. It's a Cree territory on the Albany River, and news began to filter down into the CBC and onto the pages of the Globe and Mail about this town that had a boil water advisory and had been living under a boil water advisory for decades. And this despite the fact that it was on a far northern river that Canadians like to think of as pristine wilderness. So how did it happen that this community had contaminated water? Moreover, they had issues with substandard buildings. The children in that community had no school because the school had been condemned because it had been built on PCB laboratories, there were tanks of PCBs and black mold and so on. And so they were getting their primary education in unheated portables. And all of this was all this news began coming down to us here in the city of Toronto, and I thought that I wanted to make a river, and I wanted. So the conceit of that was, I thought that through my hands and through the knitting of this object, I could in some way instigate a healing. Not that this would heal the water necessarily, although there is some metaphysical connection there, but that it would assist me to reconcile to this truth, to be able to take action. So I took copper audio wire. This is the kind of cable that you would use to carry sound. And I began to knit this long river. And as I was doing that, I composed a musical piece that would be played through this river. And it was coincidental, perhaps, that in that same year, a scientist in Europe had managed to map the human genome, mitochondrial DNA. And so miraculous is our technological age that I was able to download the human genome in these lines of coded genes, 8 pairs, all in rows. And I set that to music, and that's what plays through here. And what I was trying to talk about was they cannot eternally poison the river. They will try, but they cannot eternally poison the river. So that's what this is called. It's called Medicine River.
Nice. I wonder, I'm kind of interested around the question of artists' relationships with other artists. Naturally, that occurs in a community, but it occurs also across generations. We often call that art history.
Yes.
But I'm curious as to what extent the practices of other artists, whether under the rubric of art history or just by virtue of your own interests, has been a factor in your own thinking.
Oh, absolutely. I think that this is one of the wonderful gifts of a formal education within the Western Academy for all of us, but especially, I would say, Indigenous artists who are attempting to, in some way, not integrate our voices, but add our voices to this discourse. So I think it's enormously important that we understand the various strands in our history, where we transgress them, where we concur, where we walk side by side, I mean, that's the beautiful part. I think of this profession actually is its awareness and respect, regard for its own history. So I have been deeply influenced by my instructors, you for one of them, and other practitioners, both alive and from long ago who I will never meet. And I very much feel compelled, honored, responsible for passing this on to younger people as part of a chain, a continuum, and that Indigenous art practice hasn't been included necessarily within that larger conversation is something that I work to rectify. To speak very specifically and subjectively, even in the past 20 years here in Toronto, conditions for artists, of course, have deteriorated, I would say, hugely. So access to adequate space, and so on. But you know what? I actually don't think that is such a big factor as perhaps might be obviously assumed. I think that artists tend to thrive in situations of adversity and where it's necessary to make collaborations or to make concessions or to adjust to less than ideal conditions. And I don't think that's an obstacle to creativity. In fact, I think that sometimes this is a necessary component to making one's work. There's a balance here. There's an economy of it's both practical, but also in some ways metaphysical. There's a price to be paid for having the luxury of contemplation and that expansive kind of thinking that is required to engage in the kind of work that we do. And so, long hours, loneliness, forgetting to eat, things like this. These are concerns, but they're trivial in the long run. And trying to find good balances between this kind of crazy space that I'm in and the comfortable space that I may wish it to be. I think. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that.
Maybe I can take us
Okay.
to something else which is related, and that is the intellectual environment in which we function as artists. And one perhaps hesitates to use the word a discourse or a set of strategies that come together to create some sense of a zeitgeist, some sense of a manner of understanding the world or reacting to it.
Yes.
I wonder, building on the question of the artist in the studio, how you find yourself working with that larger zeitgeist, let's call it, if there is one.
There is one, of course, I think. I would say emphatically so. I think that there is a notion of a Canadian approach to aesthetic practice. I think that there is a dialogue, a multivalenced dialogue that is ongoing and profoundly engaged. I think being close to the center of this city and specifically to the Ontario College of Art and Design, close to the University of Toronto and Ryerson and other academic centers here in the city of Toronto is enormously nourishing to my practice, and I would imagine to others. I depend on the conversations that I have with my colleagues, my students, and my friends to help me to untangle some of the complications and obscurities that we are constantly facing, and to peel back some of the obfuscations that we're being bombarded with to find that truth, and in the peeling back of that, to create a space where something can be made in response. So I don't think that particular condition of the artist's life has changed. The condition of conversation with others and recognition of others' work. There are so many people in this city who are doing important work, and so to be in conversation with that is just wonderful. Yeah.
But a question of how we relate to one another, not simply as individuals, but as communities. One of the backstories to that, I think, is the amazing technology that has arisen in the last decade or decade and a half, the social media.
Uh-huh.
It's been theorized here and there that we have a very different world as a result of this sudden incursion of social media into our environment.
Yeah, I think, I don't think we know where we are, and I don't think we really have a sense of place, actually. I mean, I love social media, and I'm on it every day. And I have a wide network of friends and acquaintances on it, and it helps me to instantly connect with what other people are interested in and what they're doing, and so it feels social. It's not social, you know. It really is information sharing. This has a value for me, for sure, but it's not community, I don't think. I really do believe in the old Anishinaabe methodology of visiting, and this methodology of visiting doesn't involve, you know, liking someone's new status statement on Facebook. It really does involve sharing a cup of tea and talking and laughing and possibly making something in the process. And I think that I still do that. I still am maintaining that and trying to model that in my life. And so I think we have to still speak against these technologies in coaching or fabricating metaphors for what we are missing. They won't hold us together, I don't think. So yeah, it was Dylan Miner who first introduced me to this terminology, the methodology of visiting, and I think that this is a very solid way to really talk about what community is.
I want to ask you, Bonnie, about how you understand your practice in relationship to the public at large, on the one side, and the audience, by which one could imagine a professionally committed audience or public on the other side. But I just want to read something which I was quite struck by, something that you brought out in the panel discussion of the Art Gallery of Windsor a while ago. And it comes back to the Tecumseh Papers, since we quoted that earlier. At any rate, the quote I'm going to read from here. I'm not actually sure whose quote it is at this point, but the sentence I want to read is this. As viewers of the Tecumseh Papers, Devine asks us not to be mere spectators, but to pay attention, to live for a moment in a complicated world such as that inhabited by Tecumseh, and by doing so to think compassionately about the present circumstances of First Nations peoples and ways to move as allies together into an uncertain future. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the relationship of your work to the general public, as it were, on one side, and to a committed public on the other side.
This is a very interesting question. It gets to the notion of the pedagogy that is embedded in a lot of my practice, actually. And this has to do with trying to rewrite in some kind of material sense the history that we live with, and the way that that history has consistently compacted us into a kind of behavior. So my hope is that by altering the history, or our knowledge of the history, we can perhaps behave differently. But this is very complicated for me because I'm not sure that I like art to be pedagogical. And I don't like the idea that somehow or another I am representing to an unsuspecting, however compassionate audience, a unitary voice for Indigenous peoples. That's very difficult, and I have very ambivalent feelings about that. So I find curators and commentators will attempt to say that that's the goal, right? And in fact, it isn't actually. I am simply trying to respond. I'm trying to enliven the object, the art object as a participant, animate creature within our cultural sphere, to animate that so that it can speak. And so there is some complications around this, and I think that I'm not sure that Canadian artists who are not of Indigenous ancestry face these same dilemmas. I would be interested to hear if they do, actually. Do they? Do you?
Speaking personally, I have never imagined myself speaking for anyone.
No.
Perhaps most often speaking about something, but not speaking for a community.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps that's because I don't have an idea of a community. I have an idea of a world, and I have an idea of, I've studied history, so I have an idea of its dynamics to a certain degree. But I personally, and I'm not sure if I can speak for other artists, but I don't imagine myself speaking for any segment within that world. I speak for myself. So.
Yeah, and I think that it's very common. I think it's very common for all artists of color, actually, and perhaps. I shouldn't generalize because I agree with you, it's a very subjective thing. But I do find that that others complain about this matter, about the idea of representation within their work as a burden that other artists perhaps don't feel. So what I try to do is I try to shift it to the objects and to reawaken those objects in some way that gives them voice.
That does remind me, thinking of just that comment, does remind me that some have said that the contemporary world that we work within, contemporary, and by contemporary I mean perhaps most specifically the last couple of decades or more, growing perhaps out of post-colonial theory, but that the world that we work within has become very much a world of competing identities. And that if one is searching for a current discourse, that it's the discourse of identity that has, in some respects, dominated attention. I'm not sure if that's true or not.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are areas within the art world where identity is absolutely at the forefront of what is being spoken about. I'm not sure that that's where my work would locate itself. I really do think that I'm interested in history. I'm interested in text and in the written record, the written account. I'm interested in responding to that and thinking about that and complicating them. I speak very clearly about these things from a different perspective, from my own perspective, and I'm clear and direct about announcing that, so that for some viewers, this may inflect everything I say. Hopefully for others, it doesn't inflect it at all. It simply identifies it as coming from this area and opens up that space for me to speak. But yeah, I am not so much interested in speaking about identity as I am about a more common wealth or a commonly held narrative, and how do we all contribute to that?
You teach a course, and so I'm kind of curious whether theory has played a role in the development of your thought.
Absolutely. And I would say one of the wonderful things that has happened within my career as an academic has been the emergence of an Indigenous scholarship and Indigenous texts and theoretical musings on political structures, on aesthetic structures, on narrative structures. And so those theoretical frameworks are really, really important in both my teaching and in the making that I do. For instance, the notion of post-coloniality is something that I contend with because I don't feel we are in a post-colonial world. I don't think we've emerged yet from that. I don't think we have a correct or fulsome enough understanding of what the colonial pressure is that's on us, that we are burdened with. And so disentangling that has become a big part of what I would call Indigenous theory, and important work. And so yes, I'm very, very interested in that, and it's very influential in my teaching.
I'm reminded of something that struck me many years ago when Zhou Enlai was asked what he thought of the French Revolution. His answer was, "It's too early to say." Is there a particular critical perspective that you've found and brought to bear on your work that has interested you?
Yes, I think that certain notions around land, around the framing of land, around the metaphysics of land as a biosphere, as an entity, as a living organism, I think, has caught my imagination, I think. Ways of talking about objects as animate or inanimate, a different kind of framing of the phenomenon of existence, various notions from what could be termed indigenous science, and the ways that those correspond, speak to, differ from Western notions of science or scientism, I would say, and how these are ideologies largely, and so to deconstruct some of those assumptions that we make about what is true and what is not true, what is valuable and what is not valuable, what is useful and what is not useful. I think all of those things are of deep interest to me, and they frame a lot of the inquiries that I make in my work.
Have you found those critical perspectives being brought to bear on your own productions, in any constructive manner?
Always, I think. For instance, in the let me see. Maybe I can't answer that actually. I might not be able to take enough of a step back from the work that I do to be able to see exactly how that plays out. And also, I tend to move back and forth between a kind of intense thinking and writing, and then these intense periods of making. And it often takes me several years to understand how those two things connect and where the through line is. And so I can speak quite comfortably, I think, about work that is maybe 10 years old, but to speak about work that is closer to me, I'm not certain yet where that is all fitting together. So there's never a decision necessarily, a conscious decision about how these things knit together. It emerges much, much later, and often because someone else has pointed it out, actually. You know?
That someone else might be a critic.
Yes.
Do you find the critical attention to your work as being interesting or useful?
I would say, no, I think that critical attention to my work that is meaningful to me will have to come from someone who understands the issues that I'm dealing with. And unfortunately, most of the critical world is still extremely European-centric and comes at these questions of aesthetics or of practice or of structure from a set of frameworks that I don't fit into. So I become still the exotic kind of other, and so I don't look to that particular area for understanding. There are a number of younger scholars who are beginning to write in their PhD papers, and so I'm beginning to interact with those individuals from all around North America, actually, and those younger scholars are bringing a different kind of understanding to what I'm doing. But I would say in the larger framework of critical discourse? I don't think so, not yet.
Just out of curiosity, has Richard Hill ever talked about your work?
I think so, but I don't, you know what? I don't know, actually. I don't go looking around for things, and usually if I see something written, I'm hesitant to read it. I have, I probably won't look at this video, for instance. I have a phobia around that kind of thing. So I just don't look at it.
The pressures of maintaining or constructing and maintaining a career can be very hard for many artists. How have you found that yourself?
I have been very lucky, I think. I was very fortunate to find employment quite quickly upon graduating with my MFA. I found a full-time position at OCAD, which helps enormously. It gives me not enough time off, but sufficient time off for me to do my work. I'm here right in the corridor in the middle of Toronto, my studio. It's noisy, and but I've been very, very fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
So I've made some concessions. I have a very understanding partner who allows me to work late hours and, you know, have odd time structure and so on. Allows me probably is a problematic term, but we've worked something out that gives me the space that I need.
Mm-hmm.
So I have no complaints. I know that others haven't been as fortunate. Yeah.
Of course, a career happens within the art system, broadly speaking.
Mm-hmm.
I guess there are many art systems,
Mm-hmm.
but they're all political and bureaucratic and strategic, I guess. And that can be both a plus and a minus. One has to work within them if one wants to work within the art system.
Yes.
What's your experience of that?
I've been, again, very fortunate that I've found curators who are interested in exploring with me the things that are of interest. I've been fortunate in being given space to do that work and time to do that work with some very, very generous and perceptive individuals. So this has actually allowed me to grow the perspectives that I have. In terms of the gallery system, within a comfortable kind of timeline of this activity here and that activity there, I've managed to craft a good working balance, and I've managed to travel and expand the extent of my investigation in unimaginable ways, actually. I'm very grateful for the way that the art world, in its, in this particular little limited way that it deals with me, it has been good to me.
Perhaps as a final thought, Bonnie, you talked about honesty earlier, and I guess in some respects, what is real or truthful that may in fact lie between the lines of what we normally think about or assume. And when I think about those qualities, I think about something that we might call what is authentic, as opposed to the myths or the misunderstandings or the intentional political intrigues that surround both the productions of art and the context within art production happens. Of course, here in Canada, we have the usual misconceptions about who or what Canada is. We have very frequently, of course, as with everywhere, misconceptions about what an artwork is, what we expect from it. That's all to phrase the question. When it comes to the question of authenticity, the question of what is real, what one can hold in your hand, as it were, and trust, question of trust, I guess. Do you have any thoughts about how that problem emerges for you in how people see your work or see what it is that they can take away from it?
Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, art and artifice are really close, and we are, after all, in the business of constructing artifices in many ways. And the notion of fantasy, the notion of the identity of the artist as this sort of iconic figure, I think we always are dancing around this. People will always assume certain things about you because of the work that you do, and then they meet you and and everything collapses. All of that aside, I have been led by something that Carl Beam said many years ago. He said, I want to get my hands on meaningful things. And this has stayed with me and reminds me of what I would call truth, because who knows what is really true. But I do know what is meaningful. And I want to get my hands on meaningful things too. And that's where I find, my ground zero.
That's fine.